Model railroading. Now, in fairness, that's a bit misleading, but not inaccurate. Railroading in the United States, more like freight railroading, is a very important part of the transportation network of our country. Commodities are moved efficiently and quickly, taking or keeping hundreds of trucks off of our nation's highways. Coal, steel, grain, chemicals, even high fructose corn syrup are some of the things hauled by the nation's railroads. In fact, there was a time we recorded this show at a studio a stone's throw from the central, what the Union Pacific Railroad called the Central Corridor of their main corridor between Chicago and the West Coast. And we used to see full coal trains going east, empty coal trains going west, just many, constant. It was just constant. So this continues to happen. Now, ironically enough, these highways of commerce are for the most part privately owned as opposed to the nation's highways. And that's a sore spot for the industry since they have to maintain their own right-of-way and pay taxes on it as well. Since the early days of railroading, dreams of expansion were limited by a perpetual lack of capital. I can't even begin to tell you in history how many railroads were started on paper that either never got built, was started and maybe they graded a few miles of railroad right-of-way but never laid the rails, or maybe even got that far and still went broke, or was sold before the railroad even started, hauling traffic. And the way they used to do it back then, rather than spend money to buy up bankrupt railroads, they would turn around and lease a railroad to another one for like 99 years. So yeah, a lot of consolidation happened then. Consolidation's happening now. And I wanted to talk about the latest merger because it's kind of interesting and got my attention. And I need to preface, before I even start this, I'm going to tell you something. Two of the world's richest men either own a Class 1 railroad outright or is the largest shareholder in a Class 1 railroad.
Seems like something we were trying to avoid for a while.
Yeah. Can you tell, for the record, do you know who they are?
Just one, the Bill Gates one.
Uh-huh. Do you know who owns a railroad outright?
Like Warren Buffett or something dumb?
Warren Buffett. He owns the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad, one of the 4 Class 1 railroads in the United States. Berkshire Hathaway owns it outright. $44 billion they paid for it. Owned it outright. Bill Gates, however, is the major shareholder in the Canadian Pacific. And what's crazy is that there are two equivalent Class 1 railroads in Canada. The Canadian Pacific, which is privately owned, and the Canadian National, which is owned by the government. And they both go coast to coast in Canada. But interesting thing, in their quest to grow, and did not start recently, they have been buying up and building track in America. In the last probably 20 years, we'll start with Canadian National. Canadian National bought the Illinois Central, which is a major north-south railroad that gives them access to the Gulf of Mexico from Canada that cross-point at Detroit. And they can run trains all the way down there. So it gives them a way to deliver goods and services and get around major choke points. I don't know, like Chicago, that they don't necessarily have to go through. So there's that. Canadian Pacific has been on I tried reading their histories. There's so much merger and finance and going broke. I will say this, something that I did not know. Fun fact. A major investor in Canadian Pacific is a fellow by the name of James Jerome Hill. He was the founder of the Great Northern, one of the predecessor roads that became the Burlington Northern. And the Great Northern, which is the main, they are a transcontinental railroad that runs the most northern part of the country from Chicago to Seattle, is the only fully privately financed transcontinental railroad that did not take a dime in governmental subsidies ever. Not land, not anything. Yeah, blew my mind too. I didn't know that. Meanwhile, James J. Hill was a major investor in the Canadian Pacific. That I did not know.
I didn't know any of this either.
Yeah, and I know you're just
trains.
you're
trains.
so impressed.
I like trains. I like trains.
I love trains. I love trains before I love cars. So by now, listeners going, well, what's this got to do with what? Okay, I'm going to tell you. It seems that the Canadian Pacific, 11 years ago, bought a bunch of railroads that come through our fine state and the upper Midwest. Wisconsin Central, the Dakota, Minnesota, and Eastern, the Iowa, Chicago, and Eastern, giving them a way to haul freight through Canada around Chicago and get to the port. The biggest deal they made, let me back up. The Canadian Pacific tried twice in the last 10 years to merge with two other Class 1 railroads. They tried in 2014 with CSX, and they tried again in 2016 with Norfolk Southern. Both failed for a variety of reasons. This time, however, they found a railroad that would actually complements them better, and they bought the Kansas City Southern. Why does that matter? They now have a direct road into Mexico from Canada around Chicago, that all that freight doesn't have to get bottled up, and they have one continuous rail line. There is no interchanging. They don't have to. They can take a boxcar or a load of wheat from Canada to Mexico. They can take oil from Canada to Mexico. They can take auto parts, which flow between the three countries, to either place. More money for them. And it's funny because even with the merger, they're still one of the smallest of the Class 1 railroads. They're a little larger now. But it seems odd to me that it's the Canadians that are driving all of this.
You see it as a net good thing?
I'm not sure. I think part of it was driven by the recently renegotiated, I guess they call it the USMCA, which replaced the NAFTA Act in terms of borders and transferring freight and all of this. But they're going to call this thing the Canadian Pacific Kansas City Railway. Operates 20,000 miles of railway, employ 20,000 people, and generate annual revenues about $8.7 billion.